What happens when you stay silent longer than they expected? Stoicism. There is a specific kind of discomfort that settles over a room when someone refuses to defend themselves. You have felt it. An accusation lands, an insult is thrown, a provocation is dropped like bait into still water, and instead of reacting, the person simply says nothing. The silence stretches past the point where it feels normal. It stretches past the point where the accuser expected it to end. And in that stretched, uncomfortable silence, something shifts. Power quietly changes hands. The ancient Stoics understood this shift better than almost anyone in history. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire filled with flatterers, critics, and enemies disguised as friends, trained himself to withhold reaction the way a soldier trains his body for battle. Seneca warned that hasty words spoken in anger could never be unspoken again, while a well-timed silence could be broken whenever wisdom demanded it. Epictetus, who had endured slavery and physical abuse, taught that the tongue was often the first thing a wise man learned to master, because an unguarded mouth reveals every weakness an opponent needs to exploit. Tonight we are going to explore what actually happens, psychologically, socially, and strategically, when you stay silent longer than anyone expected you to. Because there is a version of silence that is weakness, the silence of a man too afraid to speak. And there is another version entirely, the silence of a man who has simply chosen not to hand his power away. Learning the difference between the two may be one of the most valuable lessons Stoic philosophy has to offer. Think about the last time you watched someone stay quiet under pressure and how differently you read that silence depending on the context. A man staring at the floor while being berated reads as defeated. A man holding steady eye contact while saying nothing reads as unshaken. The external behavior looks almost identical, yet the internal state driving it is worlds apart, and the people around them sense that difference instantly, even if they cannot name exactly what they are sensing. Tonight's lesson is about deliberately cultivating the second kind of silence, the kind rooted in composure rather than collapse. Before we continue, if this kind of wisdom speaks to you, subscribe to Quotes Library right now. This channel exists to help you build the calm, composed strength the ancients wrote about, one lesson at a time. Subscribe, and let's begin. Principle 1. Silence denies them the reaction they came for. Most provocations are not actually about the subject being argued. They are fishing expeditions, designed to pull a reaction out of you that reveals something the provoker can use. An insult tests whether you are insecure about the thing being mocked. An accusation tests whether guilt will show on your face. A raised voice tests whether you will match that energy or shrink beneath it. Every reaction you give away is information handed to someone who may not have your best interests in mind. Epictetus taught that we are only truly harmed by what we allow to disturb our judgment, not by the words themselves. Someone can hurl an insult across a room, but the insult only becomes damaging the moment you seize it, examine it, and let it rearrange your composure. Silence interrupts this exchange completely. When you do not react, there is nothing for the provocateur to seize onto, nothing to escalate, nothing to twist into further ammunition. The exchange simply stalls, and stalled exchanges rarely end in anyone's favor except the one who refused to play. This does not mean silence is passive weakness. It is closer to a locked door. The provoker knocks, expecting the door to fly open in anger or fear, and instead finds it sealed shut, unmoved by the force of the knock. Over time, people who repeatedly encounter this sealed door learn that provoking you yields nothing. They stop knocking, not because you convinced them with words, but because your silence made the entire exercise pointless. This is often the fastest way to end a pattern of provocation that arguing back would only prolong. There is another layer to this worth understanding, one rooted in perception rather than tactics alone. Bystanders watching a confrontation unfold, whether coworkers in a meeting or family members at a gathering, tend to instinctively side with whichever party appears calmer, regardless of who is technically correct on the substance of the disagreement. Composure reads as credibility, even when no one in the room could articulate exactly why. A person who stays silent, measured, and unshaken while another grows louder often wins the room's sympathy without saying a single word in their own defense. The Stoics did not chase the approval of onlookers, but they understood, as a natural consequence of disciplined character, that composure tends to earn trust far more reliably than volume ever does. There is also a deeper reason this works, rooted in how confrontation is designed to function. Most provocations follow an unspoken script, an opening jab, an expected counter, an escalating exchange that builds towards some kind of resolution or exhaustion. When you refuse to deliver your expected line, the entire script collapses. The provoker is left holding words with nowhere to send them, and without a counter to escalate against, the confrontation simply has nowhere left to go. Scripts require two willing participants. Silence removes one of them entirely, and a script with only one actor rarely holds anyone's attention for long. This is why so many people who provoke others eventually move on to easier targets. Confrontation, at its core, often seeks a payoff, whether that payoff is dominance, entertainment, or validation. A target who refuses to supply that payoff becomes uninteresting to provoke, regardless of how loud or aggressive the initial attempt was. The Stoics understood this dynamic intuitively, which is precisely why so many of their teachings on composure double as teachings on self-protection. A calm, unreactive presence is often safer than any argument could ever make you, simply because it removes the incentive for conflict before conflict has a chance to take root. Principle 2. Silence forces them to reveal more than you do. When two people argue, information flows in both directions, but rarely equally. The person speaking more tends to reveal more assumptions, more insecurities, more of the actual motive behind the confrontation. The Stoics understood that restraint was not only a matter of discipline but also a matter of strategy. A man who listens far more than he speaks gathers far more understanding of his opponent than the opponent gathers of him. Consider how uncomfortable silence becomes for someone who expected a fight. When you refuse to fill the space with defense or counterattack, the other person is often compelled to keep talking simply to escape the discomfort of an unanswered accusation. And the longer they talk, the more they reveal, sometimes contradicting themselves, sometimes exposing insecurities they never intended to show, sometimes revealing that the entire confrontation was rooted in something that had nothing to do with you at all. Seneca advised his students to observe carefully before responding, because a hasty reply often reveals your hand before you have even understood the game being played. Silence buys you that understanding. It lets you watch rather than react, gather rather than give, and by the time you finally do choose to speak, if you choose to speak at all, you are speaking from a position built on far more information than the person standing across from you. This asymmetry, quiet as it looks from the outside, is often the deciding factor in who walks away from a confrontation with their composure intact. There is also a subtler benefit to this asymmetry that few people consider. Information gathered in silence tends to be more accurate than information gathered through argument, because argument distorts perception on both sides. When you are busy formulating your next counterpoint, you are not truly listening to what the other person is saying. Your attention splits between their words and your rebuttal, and something important almost always gets lost in that split. Silence removes the rebuttal from the equation entirely, freeing your full attention to actually absorb what is being said, including the parts spoken carelessly, the parts that reveal more truth than the speaker intended. Seneca often reminded his students that understanding a conflict fully before responding to it was not a delay tactic but a form of respect, both for the truth of the situation and for your own eventual response. A reply built on full understanding carries far more weight than one built on partial listening interrupted by the urge to defend yourself. This is one of the quiet advantages that silence offers, an advantage rarely visible in the moment but often decisive in how the conflict ultimately resolves. If this is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe to Quotes Library. We bring you Stoic wisdom designed to sharpen your mind and steady your composure in every kind of confrontation life throws at you. Hit that subscribe button and let's keep going. Principle 3. The story of Cassian and the Council of Voices. Let me tell you a short story that illustrates this lesson clearly. In a provincial Roman town, there lived a young magistrate named Cassian, recently appointed to settle disputes among the townspeople. Cassian was intelligent, but early in his post he made a habit of responding immediately to every accusation brought before him, defending his rulings loudly whenever someone challenged his judgment. The townspeople quickly learned that if they pushed hard enough, Cassian would argue back, and arguments, they discovered, could be dragged out for hours, sometimes reversing decisions simply through persistence and noise. An older advisor named Flavian noticed this pattern and pulled Cassian aside one evening. Flavian told him a story about a council of elders he had once served, men who never rushed to answer a challenge. When accused of unfairness, they would simply sit in silence, letting the accuser's words hang in the air until the accuser, uncomfortable with the emptiness, either withdrew the accusation or clarified it into something far more reasonable than the original outburst. Flavian explained that silence was not the absence of an answer. It was a different kind of answer entirely, one that forced the accuser to confront their own words rather than hide behind Cassian's reaction to them. Cassian began practicing this immediately. The next time a merchant stormed into his chambers, furious over a ruling regarding a property dispute, Cassian said nothing. He simply looked at the man calmly, allowing the anger to fill the room uninterrupted. The merchant, expecting a defensive reply, grew increasingly uncomfortable with his own volume in a silence that refused to match it. Within minutes, his fury softened into a far more measured explanation of his complaint, one Cassian could actually address fairly. Over the following months, Cassian's reputation shifted entirely. Where he was once known as a magistrate who could be worn down through persistence, he became known as a man whose calm was unshakable. Disputes brought before him were resolved faster, because people arrived already knowing that theatrics would not move him. Cassian had not become a harsher judge. He had simply learned that silence, held longer than anyone expected, carried more authority than any argument he could have constructed in the moment. What made Cassian's transformation lasting rather than temporary was the fact that he did not treat silence as a trick to be deployed only when convenient. He practiced it deliberately, even in low-stakes conversations, training the habit the same way a soldier drills a maneuver long before facing real battle. By the time high-stakes confrontations arrived, the silence felt natural to him rather than forced, and the people testing him could sense the difference between a performance and a genuine, settled composure. Performances crack under pressure. Genuine discipline holds. Principle 4. Silence preserves your energy for what actually matters. Every argument you engage in costs something. It costs time, it costs emotional energy, and often it costs a measure of your composure that takes far longer to rebuild than it took to lose. The Stoics were deeply concerned with the wise allocation of a person's limited resources, and they considered emotional energy one of the most valuable resources a person possessed. Spending it on every provocation that crossed your path was, in their eyes, a form of self-neglect. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about reserving his energy for matters within his control, and refusing to squander it on the opinions or provocations of people whose approval meant nothing to his actual duties. This is a discipline worth applying broadly. Not every insult deserves a rebuttal. Not every accusation deserves a defense delivered on the spot. Some conflicts are simply not worth the resource cost required to engage them, and silence allows you to conserve that resource for the moments that genuinely require it. Think about how drained you feel after a heated argument compared to how composed you feel after choosing not to engage one at all. The difference is not imaginary. Arguments trigger physiological stress responses, elevated heart rate, tightened muscles, a flood of cortisol that lingers long after the confrontation ends. Choosing silence is not simply a social strategy. It is a form of self-preservation, protecting your nervous system from unnecessary strain so that your energy remains available for the pursuits that actually build your life rather than the disputes that merely drain it. Consider tallying, honestly, how many arguments you have engaged in over the past year that actually changed anything. Not arguments that felt satisfying in the moment, but arguments that produced a genuine shift in outcome, understanding, or relationship quality. For most people, the total is startlingly small compared to the emotional cost paid across all those confrontations combined. This is not a call to avoid every disagreement. Some conflicts genuinely matter and deserve full engagement. It is a call to become far more selective about which battles receive your energy, treating that energy as the finite, valuable resource the Stoics always understood it to be. Principle 5. The discomfort they feel is not yours to fix. One of the hardest parts of practicing extended silence is tolerating the discomfort it creates in others, and resisting the urge to rescue them from that discomfort. Humans are wired for reciprocity in conversation. When someone speaks to us, our instinct is to respond, to fill the gap, to smooth over the awkwardness of an unanswered statement. Provocateurs often rely on this instinct, expecting that discomfort alone will pressure you into speaking before you are ready. The Stoics taught a different relationship with discomfort. Epictetus reminded his students that other people's emotional reactions were not within their control, and attempting to manage those reactions on someone else's behalf was often a wasted effort. If your silence makes someone uncomfortable, that discomfort belongs to them, born from their own expectations about how the exchange should unfold. You are not obligated to resolve it simply because it exists. This can feel almost cruel at first, especially for people conditioned to smooth over every tense moment out of habit. But there is a difference between cruelty and boundaries. Cruelty seeks to cause harm. A boundary simply refuses to absorb responsibility for someone else's emotional state. Staying silent while someone squirms in the space they created for themselves is not an act of aggression. It is simply a refusal to rescue them from a situation they walked into voluntarily. Over time, this refusal teaches people to bring you clearer, calmer communication, because they learn that manipulation through discomfort no longer works on you. This principle extends beyond confrontation into everyday relationships as well. Some people, without even realizing it, use discomfort as a communication tool, going quiet, sighing loudly, or dropping hints rather than stating what they actually need. When you rush to fix every uncomfortable silence you encounter, you inadvertently reward this indirect style of communication, teaching the people around you that discomfort works as a lever to pull your reaction. Holding steady in the face of that discomfort, without coldness but without rescue either, often produces a healthier long-term outcome. People eventually learn to communicate directly with you, because indirect discomfort no longer gets them the reaction they used to rely on. Take a moment right now and subscribe to Quotes Library if you have not already. This channel is built for people who want to master their emotional composure and stop giving away power in moments that do not deserve it. Subscribe, and let's continue. Principle 6. Silence buys time for wisdom to catch up to emotion. In the heat of confrontation, emotion moves faster than wisdom. Anger, embarrassment, and defensiveness fire almost instantly, long before the slower, more deliberate parts of your mind have had a chance to evaluate the situation clearly. This is precisely why so many people say things in the middle of arguments that they regret within the hour. The tongue moved before the mind caught up. Seneca wrote extensively about this exact gap, urging his students to build the habit of pausing before responding to anger, specifically because the earliest impulse is so rarely the wisest one. Silence, held even for a short stretch, creates room for wisdom to close that gap. It gives the slower, more deliberate parts of the mind a chance to arrive at the scene before the mouth commits to a reaction that cannot be taken back. The longer you can comfortably hold that silence, the wider the gap you create between impulse and response, and the wiser your eventual words become as a result. This is not about suppressing emotion entirely. It is about refusing to let raw, unexamined emotion dictate your words before wisdom has had a fair chance to weigh in. A person who has trained themselves to stay silent longer than expected has, in effect, trained themselves to respond from wisdom far more often than from impulse, and the difference in outcomes over a lifetime of confrontations is enormous. There is a physical dimension to this gap worth understanding as well. Researchers studying stress response have long noted that the body's initial reaction to conflict mirrors its reaction to physical danger, a flood of adrenaline preparing you to fight or flee a threat that is, in most modern confrontations, not actually physical at all. Speaking immediately from that flooded state means speaking from biology rather than philosophy. A brief pause, even a handful of seconds, gives that flood a chance to recede enough for genuine thought to take over. The Stoics did not have modern language for this physiological process, but their instruction to pause before responding lines up remarkably well with what we now understand about the body's reaction to perceived threat. Principle 7. Their expectations are not your obligation. Every relationship, every workplace, every social circle develops unspoken expectations about how quickly you should respond to conflict. Some environments train people to expect instant rebuttals, instant explanations, instant emotional displays proving that words have landed. When you break that expectation by staying silent longer than the pattern predicts, you are not failing to meet an obligation. You are simply declining to honor an expectation that was never yours to accept in the first place. Epictetus taught that much of human suffering comes from believing we are bound by expectations that others have quietly assigned to us without our consent. Someone expecting an immediate reaction from you has made an assumption about your behavior, not a rule you agreed to follow. Silence that outlasts their expectation is not rudeness. It is simply the natural result of refusing to operate inside a framework you never signed up for. This principle can feel uncomfortable to apply, especially with people who have grown accustomed to your quick reactions over years of interaction. They may accuse you of coldness, of avoidance, of suddenly becoming distant. But changing your response pattern is not a betrayal of the relationship. It is a recalibration of it, one that often produces healthier dynamics once the initial discomfort passes. People who genuinely respect you will adjust to a wiser version of you. People who only valued your predictability will resist the change, and their resistance often reveals exactly how much of the relationship depended on your willingness to react on command. It helps to prepare for this resistance in advance, because it will come, and it can feel disorienting if you were not expecting it. Someone accustomed to your instant reactions may escalate at first, poking harder to find the old response they are used to receiving. This escalation is not proof that your new approach is wrong. It is simply the friction that appears whenever a familiar pattern gets disrupted. Hold steady through that friction, and in most cases, it settles far faster than people expect, replaced by a relationship recalibrated around a calmer, more deliberate version of you. Principle 8. The story continued, what Cassian learned about enemies. Let us return briefly to Cassian, the young magistrate. Word of his newfound composure eventually reached a rival official named Drusus, a man who had long resented Cassian's rising reputation. Drusus, hoping to publicly humiliate him, arranged to challenge one of Cassian's rulings in front of the entire town council, expecting the young magistrate to either crumble under the pressure of public scrutiny or lash out in a way that would damage his credibility. Cassian listened to the entire challenge without interruption, allowing Drusus to build his case fully, growing louder and more theatrical as the silence stretched on. When Drusus finally finished, expecting an immediate defense, Cassian simply thanked him for his thorough presentation and stated that he would review the matter carefully before responding, a response Drusus had not prepared for at all. The council, expecting a heated exchange, instead witnessed calm professionalism from one side and mounting frustration from the other. Drusus, thrown off by the absence of conflict, began repeating himself, restating points he had already made, visibly searching for a reaction that never came. By the time the council session ended, it was Drusus who appeared unstable and reactive, while Cassian appeared measured and trustworthy. The rivalry Drusus had hoped to win through public confrontation instead became the very moment that cemented Cassian's reputation as a leader who could not be baited into unraveling. Cassian never raised his voice once. He simply outlasted the noise, and outlasting it was enough. Principle 9. Silence is not the same as suppression. It is important to draw a clear line here, because Stoic silence is often misunderstood as emotional suppression, and the two are not the same thing at all. Suppression is forcing feelings underground, pretending they do not exist, building pressure that eventually erupts in unhealthy ways. Stoic silence, by contrast, is choosing not to express a reaction externally while still fully acknowledging that reaction internally, processing it honestly rather than pretending it away. Marcus Aurelius wrote candidly in his private journal about anger, frustration, and disappointment he felt toward specific people and situations. He did not pretend these feelings were absent. He simply chose, deliberately, not to unleash them onto the people who provoked them, understanding that private processing was far more productive than public venting. This distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to apply this lesson in their own life. If you find yourself staying silent externally while quietly seething internally with no outlet at all, that silence is closer to suppression than to Stoic discipline, and it will eventually cost you, whether through stress, resentment, or an eventual explosion that undoes months of careful composure. The healthier path is to pair external silence with private processing, through journaling, reflection, or conversation with someone trusted outside the conflict itself. This way, the silence you show the world remains sustainable, because it is not hiding an untended wound underneath it. There is a particular danger in skipping this internal processing step that deserves mention. People who suppress rather than process often find their composure eventually fails them at the worst possible moment, not with the original provoker, but with someone entirely unrelated who happens to be present when the build-up pressure finally releases. A partner, a family member, a stranger who made an innocent comment at the wrong time, all can become unintended targets of an explosion that had nothing to do with them. Marcus Aurelius avoided this trap precisely because his journal gave his frustrations somewhere legitimate to go. Find your own version of that outlet, whether it is writing, physical exercise, or an honest conversation with someone you trust completely, so that your composure in public remains genuine rather than a mask stretched thin over unresolved pressure. If you are finding value in this lesson, this is a good moment to subscribe to Quotes Library. We release videos exactly like this one, built to help you handle conflict with clarity rather than chaos. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Principle 10. When silence should end. Silence is a tool, not a permanent state, and knowing when to break it is just as important as knowing how to hold it. The Stoics were not advocates of endless withdrawal or permanent avoidance. Marcus Aurelius still governed, still issued decisions, still spoke plainly when the situation demanded clarity. The goal was never silence for its own sake. The goal was choosing the right moment to speak, rather than being dragged into speech by someone else's timeline. A useful guideline the Stoics might offer is this: speak when your words will serve truth, justice, or necessary clarity, and remain silent when your words would only serve your ego or someone else's provocation. If clarifying a misunderstanding genuinely benefits the situation, silence has served its purpose and speech becomes appropriate. If speaking would only escalate a conflict that silence has already begun diffusing, the silence deserves to continue a while longer. This discernment takes practice, and it will not always be perfect. There will be moments you speak too soon and moments you stay quiet longer than necessary. What matters is the underlying discipline, choosing your moment deliberately rather than reactively. A person who has mastered this discipline is rarely predictable to those seeking to provoke them, and unpredictability, in this specific sense, becomes a form of quiet strength that few people ever learn to wield with any real consistency. There is one final marker worth watching for, a signal that tells you the discipline has genuinely taken root rather than remaining a technique you consciously apply. That marker is the disappearance of resentment. Early in this practice, silence can feel like a battle of wills, a gritted teeth restraint held together by effort. Over time, with enough repetition, the silence stops requiring effort at all. Provocations that once tested your composure simply stop landing with the same force, not because you have grown numb, but because your sense of self no longer depends on winning every verbal exchange that crosses your path. When silence becomes effortless rather than forced, you know the discipline has moved from a skill you practice into a trait you now possess. Principle 11. Silence is a signal of self-respect. There is one more dimension to extended silence worth naming clearly. Beyond strategy, beyond energy conservation, beyond the tactical advantages already discussed, choosing not to react to every provocation is ultimately a statement about how you value your own peace. Every reaction handed away carelessly says, implicitly, that your composure is available to anyone willing to poke hard enough for it. Holding silence longer than expected says the opposite. It says your peace is not for sale, not to a stranger's insult, not to a rival's baiting, not even to a loved one's careless words spoken in a moment of frustration. Seneca described tranquility as one of the highest goods a person could cultivate, more valuable than wealth, more stable than reputation, because tranquility, once genuinely built, cannot be stolen by external circumstance. A person who guards their reactions carefully is, in effect, guarding this tranquility, refusing to let it be auctioned off cheaply to whoever shows up demanding attention through conflict. This is not arrogance. It is simply the recognition that your internal state is valuable enough to protect deliberately rather than surrender by default. The next time you feel the old pull to respond instantly, to prove a point, to win an exchange that ultimately means little in the larger arc of your life, remember that the silence available to you in that moment is not a failure to engage. It is a form of self-respect, quietly declaring that your peace answers to you and to no one else. Conclusion. Let the silence speak first. If you have ever walked away from a confrontation wishing you had said less, or wondered what might have happened if you had simply waited a little longer before responding, tonight's lesson was built for you. The ancient Stoics understood something that our reactive, noisy culture has largely forgotten. Restraint is not weakness. It is one of the most powerful tools available to anyone willing to master it. Think of Cassian, who transformed his reputation not through louder arguments but through calmer silence. Think of Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire while privately processing every frustration rather than unleashing it onto everyone around him. Think of Epictetus, who understood that the tongue reveals every weakness an unguarded mind has not yet mastered. None of these men avoided conflict entirely. They simply refused to let conflict dictate the terms of their response. The next time someone expects you to react immediately, to defend yourself loudly, to match their volume and their urgency, consider staying silent a little longer than they expect. Watch what shifts in the room. Watch what they reveal while you reveal nothing. And when the moment finally comes to speak, speak from wisdom rather than impulse, from clarity rather than heat. None of this requires becoming a different person overnight. It begins with a single conversation, a single provocation met with a pause instead of a reflex. Notice how that one pause feels. Notice what it reveals about the person testing you, and notice what it reveals about your own capacity for restraint you may not have realized you had. Build from there, one held silence at a time, until the discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like who you simply are. Subscribe to Quotes Library before you go. Instead of a reflex, notice how that one pause feels. Notice what it reveals about the person testing you, and notice what it reveals about your own capacity for restraint you may not have realized you had. Build from there, one held silence at a time, until the discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like who you simply are. Subscribe to Quotes Library before you go, so you never miss a lesson like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment about a time your own silence spoke louder than words ever could, and let's keep building this community of people choosing composure over chaos. Keep becoming.